Okay, so for those of you that have just arrived, we have the wonderful Marc Rowland on the screen. He has said that if anyone has any questions while he's speaking, please do chip in. So I'm going to leave our microphone on. So if you could avoid excess general hubbub, but if you do have something you want to ask Marc partway through, do just shout. All right, Marc, you ready?
Thank you, Susie. And look, good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry, that BBC Sports Personality of the Year, isn't it? When Andy Murray wins and he doesn't turn up to collect the award, doing this. But look, thank you for coming to listen to me speak. And Susie's right. If you've got anything you want to ask me or want to interrupt, just shout. And really, really briefly, within the context of a 40-minute talk, I'll make some generalizations about children, students, pupils from less affluent backgrounds. Those are not my views or my values, but it's just going to get a bit dull if I sort of caveat sort of every point that I make. I'm really happy for these slides, if they're useful to you, to be shared after the session by Susie as well. So if that's a helpful thing to do. And yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about, I guess this really complex and entrenched issue that haunts our education system around the underachievement of pupils from less affluent backgrounds, from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And last week I sort of visited my 750th school to do a strategy review. So just wanted to share some reflections around that, if that's okay. I'm going to try and talk about this from a strategic level, at a school leadership level, but also, what we need to be thinking about in the classroom. We don't address educational disadvantage through big shiny interventions. Rather, it's about every moment in every aspect of school life being seen through the lens of our disadvantaged pupils. It's not one big intervention, it's 1,000 little interactions, day in, day out, week in, week out, term in, term out, that make the biggest difference. So anyway, so look, forgive me, it's a bit Gilroy Lockhart, isn't it, sharing your own publication as part of a presentation or a talk, so forgive me for that. But I just wanted to pick out some reflections from this red book that we published well, about a year and a half ago now. And that's the culmination of 10 years of work trying to understand what is happening in schools and classrooms where disadvantaged pupils were thriving, what is happening in schools and classrooms where we found this a tougher nut to crack. And I would just want to share some of those reflections with you. I think the first thing to say is that students, pupils, children are not at risk of underachievement because they're pupil premium. They're at risk of underachievement because of the impact of socioeconomic disadvantage on their learning over time, which is a process, not an event. In many cases, it's something that starts prenatal. So we have to take a long-term view as to how we respond to it. I think we also need to be really wary of, I think, sometimes this idea of trying to middle classize disadvantaged pupils and their families. And what we have to do, I think, it's essential really, is that we lose the deficit discourse around disadvantage, that our disadvantaged pupils, our families, are a problem to be fixed, but rather we need to flip that on its head and be thinking about how do we draw our disadvantaged pupils and their families into the school community? How do we get better at ensuring that our disadvantaged pupils are thriving in the classroom? Too much effort and energy, I think, historically has been placed in terms of addressing disadvantage on end of key stage results and exam results. And of course, those are really important. Academic attainment gives us choice and opportunity, but too much focus has been placed on years 6 and years 10 and 11, chuck in the kitchen sink at those year groups, rather than a culture of early intervention that helps pupils to be better learners. That's the key to all of this, that we help pupils to be better learners and thinking about their everyday experiences in the classroom, again, trying to create that sense of belonging. So that's what I want to talk about in the session. Across the country, we've found very little difference between schools where disadvantaged pupils are thriving compared to where we found this a more difficult issue to get to grips with in terms of how the pupil premium is spent. We found very little difference between schools where disadvantaged pupils are thriving compared to where they're struggling in terms of the activities that schools adopt to try and address this issue. The difference seems to be, and I want to emphasize the seems because we're not certain about this, the difference seems to be not the type of activity, but the number of activities that we try and do. And counterintuitively, the more things that we try and do at the same time, the less effective they are. And we end up with initiative fatigue, and actually sometimes a cynicism around disadvantage too. So it's about choosing really, really carefully strategies rooted in the needs of our pupils, which is informed by diagnostic assessment and our knowledge of our pupils and knowledge of our community. So it's about choosing a small number of things and relentlessly focusing on those rather than trying to do, too many things at once. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. It's also important that we intervene to pupils' learning needs rather than the label. That's another one of the reasons why pupil premium as a policy hasn't always been as effective as it could have been, is that that sometimes we ask the wrong questions. We think about what do we need to do for our pupil premium pupils, rather than think about how does disadvantage impact on pupils' learning more generally. There are lots of pupils in our education system that experience socioeconomic disadvantage that aren't eligible for the pupil premium. So we need to be thinking more generally about disadvantage in our own schools and our own school communities. Teachers and school leaders are best placed to determine how disadvantage impacts on students' learning. The pupil premium is a pretty blunt proxy for that disadvantage. It's a flag for pupils at risk of underachievement, but we need to be experts in our children, experts in our students, rather than labels. That's exciting and empowering for teachers and leaders, isn't it? That we want to get to know our pupils and families as well as we can and draw them into the school community. The other thing that we found in schools where disadvantaged pupils are struggling is responsibility and ownership for the learning and day-to-day school experiences of disadvantaged pupils sitting with one or two people. And that responsibility often being passed around school like the baton in the 100-meter relay race. And of course, that baton sometimes sort of getting dropped. So in schools where we see disadvantaged pupils thriving, there's a collective understanding about how disadvantage impacts on children's learning. There's a collective responsibility in terms of how we're going to respond to that. And individuals within the school community understanding what their roles are, whether I'm a curriculum leader, a phase leader, an early career teacher, a member of the pastoral team, I understand what my role is in addressing it. So it's about ensuring that teachers and support staff have the capacity, the professional development, the knowledge, the expertise to ensure that disadvantaged pupils are thriving in our classrooms on a day-to-day basis. All about creating a sense of belonging. You'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to read loads of slides out to you and going at this Saturday afternoon to do that, but the sense of belonging, I think, is absolutely critical. And I just want to pick out a few themes, and there's a great article from our wonderful colleagues at Durrington Research School about levelling the playing field at the bottom of this slide, which you can access. It's on the Research School website. Levelling the playing field by empowering pupils with the key knowledge they need to thrive in the classroom at the beginning of lessons. Knowledge empowers pupils to belong. And one of the biggest challenges that we find, and I'm generalizing here for disadvantaged pupils, is sometimes a lack of background knowledge because of the impact of poverty, meaning those pupils have got fewer choices for enrichment opportunity outside of school. But I'll give a really good example of this. We were in a primary school in Sheffield a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about background knowledge being a really difficult issue for disadvantaged pupils. The Year 5 lesson and the pupils have been asked to research Sri Lanka. Now, researching things that you know a lot about is really difficult. Researching things that you don't know anything about is nigh on impossible. And what we talked, and of course, as a and I understand why the teacher had done that. They were trying to encourage independent learning behaviours, good use of ICT, those kinds of things. But actually, if we'd have empowered those pupils with some, sort of key bits of knowledge about Sri Lanka at the start of that lesson, their research and their fact finding could have been so much more informative. We could have told pupils about, fauna and flora in Sri Lanka, about food, about religion, about sport, about recent history and the civil war there. As without that key knowledge, it just ended up being sort of copying and pasting, sort of Google links. So empowering pupils with the key knowledge they need to thrive in the classroom at the start of lessons. And that's here we really need to be wary of curriculum narrowing for our disadvantaged pupils. All too often, again, our disadvantaged pupils might lack broad vistas because of poverty, meaning they have fewer choices sort of outside of school. Socioeconomic disadvantage, meaning they have fewer choice and opportunities. And all too often, if we're not careful, through well-intentioned but quite problematic over-intervention, our pupils with the narrowest vistas outside of school can end up with the narrowest curriculum experience in school, and our pupils with the broadest vistas outside of school, can get the broadest, richest curriculum experience in school. And that's when we have the Matthew effect in action, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The challenge, of course, here is that some academic and pastoral interventions are absolutely necessary, and I would argue pretty much that our efforts to address disadvantage pretty much stand or fall on how well children learn to read and then transition to reading to learn. So it's a really difficult trade-off, but we need to be wary of curriculum narrowing. My final point on this slide really is about the importance of clear structures and routines. Not the most exciting thing to be talking about, but I think, again, generalizing, you think about some of our most disadvantaged pupils at the moment, particularly. These are pupils and families that have insecurity running through their lives, like Yarmouth through a stick of rock. It's income insecurity, housing insecurity, food insecurity, heating insecurity, fuel insecurity, maybe relationship insecurity. So that safety and security and consistency of experience, and a clear language around what do we mean by high quality teaching and those experiences in the classroom is fundamental to success, particularly for those pupils that might be experiencing some social emotional difficulties or struggling with attendance. So routines and structures, not the most exciting thing to talk about, but I think they're fundamental to relationships thriving. Relationships are key here. But we need those structures and routines for relationships to thrive. And when we talk about relationships, I just really want to emphasize that building relationships with our pupils and indeed our families is no soft option. It sounds really fluffy and cuddly, doesn't it? We should have good relationships with everybody. But particularly with some families who find it really difficult to engage with school, to build those relationships, you need determination, resilience, perseverance, a thick skin sometimes, and you need everybody on board and committed to those. So it's no soft option, that theme around relationships. Okay. So linked to that, just want to say a little bit about sort of high expectations. High expectations, again, fundamental to disadvantaged pupils thriving in our schools. And but we need to have a clear language around what do we mean by high expectations in a school. It's difficult to imagine, isn't it, going into any school or classroom and colleagues saying, well, we've got low expectations of our disadvantaged pupils. So we need a clear language and understanding about what do we mean by this. It's not for me to define, but for me personally, this is about all pupils, irrespective of background and starting points, being included in and experiencing success in challenging learning. I think the point around curriculum equity and curriculum narrowing is a really important one around high expectations. And then also, I think that our disadvantaged pupils, particularly those that are lower prior attainers, have at least equitable access to well-trained, well-qualified, experienced staff members. Again, otherwise we have that Matthew effect in action. The other thing that I think to be really, really wary of, is potential problems with the pupil premium label, or indeed labels sort of more generally, which risk creating a subconscious bias around what pupils sort of can't do. We did some really interesting work a few years ago with teachers in Cornwall, asking them, what's the first thing you think about when I say pupil premium? What's the first thing you think about when I say free school meals? What's the first thing you think about when you say send? And colleagues talking about how those labels can get used interchangeably with low attainment. The label low ability also very much creates a subconscious battle. It's Mark, he's low ability. We can't expect him to write as much, to speak as much in class, and that can set limits on a child's an expectation on what they can do over a child's school career. So it is these little moments make all the difference. We can also have subconscious biases around colleagues in Cornwall talked about subconscious bias around surnames as well. Oh no, I've got another Rowland. You should have seen. His brothers never did their home learning either. And again, those biases can create sort of limits on what pupils can achieve. Now, it's this really difficult balance, isn't it, between knowing pupils and knowing them really, really well, but also avoiding prior knowledge, lowering expectations of what pupils can do. What knowledge of pupils and families can help us to do is to intervene early and upstream. We know, for example, that pupils with an inconsistent attendance pattern in upper Key Stage 2 are at high risk of being really poor attenders, in Key Stage 3. So that knowledge can enable us to intervene early, put those pupils into student leadership roles, create mentors, put in place strong relational strategies to help those pupils to thrive in the secondary phase. Anyway, I think personally, it's time to put the pupil premium label the pupil premium monster back in its box and become expert in our pupils. We need to be expert in our pupils, not labels. So it's absolutely critical that we have a really strong understanding of how disadvantage impacts on all of our pupils' learning. The last few years have really shown us, haven't we, that disadvantage can impact on so many different pupils, so many different families. Also, disadvantage is not static; it's not something to be solved. It's a process, not an event. I think these are the three key questions to be asking. How does disadvantage impact on pupils learning and their wider experiences in school, in our school community? And the community part of this is really important, because what I mean by this is that it's very different growing up as a disadvantaged young person in rural Norfolk than it is in Norwich, than it is in Great Yarmouth on the coast, than it is in Camden in North London. It's not easier or more difficult, it's different, but disadvantage presents differently in different sort of communities. So if we're growing up as a disadvantaged young person in rural North Norfolk, you might have a lack of access to social services, to travel, transport, those kind of things, where you wouldn't have that challenge perhaps in Camden in North London, but those pupils might in fact experience other challenges. Anyway, that we focus on the controllable factors that are impacting on our disadvantaged pupils. Schools, teachers can't solve all of society's problems, and neither should we try to. We need to focus on those things that are in our gift and in our influence, and that is about the day-to-day experiences of pupils in the classroom and in wider school life. What are the controllable factors? and that is about the quality of the learning experience for pupils in the classroom. It's about their experiences in wider school life. What this is about is enabling those pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds to thrive in our classrooms. And then the third question is arrowing into what are the things that are most preventing disadvantaged pupils from thriving in our classroom and attaining well. So we need diagnostic, we need multiple sources of data to understand the challenges for our disadvantaged pupils. Diagnostic assessment, academic and pastoral. Teachers' knowledge of pupils as individuals. Observations of pupils' learning behaviours. Who are those pupils that find it much more difficult to speak up in class? We see desktop truancy, children in the classroom but just keeping their heads down and getting through the lessons. Conversations with pupils, conversations with families, and aggregating that knowledge of pupils together to inform both a general approach around disadvantage and what those personal challenges for individuals. Poorly identified pupil need leads to poorly identified sort of activity, leads to weaker outcomes for our disadvantaged pupils. And then we end up with what we call the supermarket sweep approach to disadvantage, where we're trying to grab hold of interventions and hope that some of them will stick, rather than a really tightly focused approach that is arrowing in on those things that are most preventing disadvantaged pupils from thriving in the classroom. That really rigorous assessment of need around how disadvantage impacts on learning also helps us to intervene early. An early intervention improves pupils as learners and just enables them to enjoy school more. And I think everybody should enjoy school, irrespective of background, irrespective of starting points. One of the things has really come forth over the last few years, isn't it, that school matters to all children, but it particularly matters to children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. Anyway, so my final point on this, I think it's really important. Our efforts to address disadvantage stand or fall on that rigorous assessment of need. So if there's one thing to take away from today's talk, it's that we are relentless in the idea that it's assessment, not assumptions about pupils, should drive our approach. It's pupils' needs, not labels. Okay, so just thinking about how we respond to this, then this is the Education Endowment Foundation Teaching and Learning Toolkit that I'm sure that you're all familiar with. And once we've got that really rigorous assessment of need, we can start to think about what are our best bets in terms of how we respond to it. So on the left-hand side are the things that have the biggest effect sizes: metacognition, self-regulation, reading comprehension strategies, oral language interventions, feedback, mastery learning. You can see these are strategies that are relatively inexpensive, have a good evidence base that sits behind them, big effect sizes. They're all about classroom interactions, aren't they? Adult pupil or pupil interactions. They're all things that help to improve pupils as learners. The sting in the tail, of course, is that they're all really difficult to implement. The things on the right-hand side are all about structures and things that sit outside of the classroom. As you can see, the evidence base for those is less secure, costs often higher, much more limited effect sizes. I think it's really exciting because it tells us how teachers really, really matter to our disadvantaged pupils. Relationships matter, don't they? These things on the left-hand side are all about relationships and classroom interactions, but they are more difficult to implement. If we take feedback as an example, it's difficult to imagine, isn't it, a classroom in the country where there isn't some kind of feedback going on. But too much feedback sadly falls on stony ground and doesn't help pupils in the way that we would hope to. And I just want to unpick that for a moment. Firstly, and really interestingly, well, I think it's interesting anyway, but maybe that's why I spend so much time on my own. But most of that evidence around feedback comes from PE or sports participation. music, and subjects like dance. So what is it about feedback in PE that makes it really effective? Now, feedback is always going to be domain specific, isn't it? But I think this is really interesting. So cut me off if there's any PE specialists on the call, in the room, but I think this is about feedback being really effective in that subject because it's in the moment, because it's personal to me as an individual. It's almost certainly modeled to me as to how to do it better, both by my peers and my teacher, and then I'll have immediate opportunities to try it out again. It will also, I suspect, be very, very specific to the thing that I'm trying to do. It's not just feedback in tennis, is it? It's about how, to hit a backhand, top spin, that down the line, with precision. It'll be really specific about the issue that I'm trying to get to grips with. The other thing about feedback is that if we're not careful, it become a gap widener rather than something that closes the gap because of two things. Firstly, my ability to take on board feedback is dependent on my perception of myself as a learner. And that might just in one subject, it might be across the board. So if I have a negative perception of myself as a learner, I'm going to find it much more difficult to take on board feedback than if I have a positive one. I'm sure you've got lots of pupils that work with us, sometimes chasing around school, wanting more and more feedback. Whereas for some pupils, it can be like treading eggshells, can't it? And we expect pupils to take on board lots and lots of feedback through their school day. I don't know about you, but feedback's hard. Feedback's hard, and particularly if you're less confident about what you're doing. The other thing is really around relationships. It's far easier to take on board feedback from someone you've got a really tight relationship with, that is really invested in you, than someone that you don't have that tight relationship with. And it's why we hear pupils say all the time, they don't listen to feedback from perhaps supply teachers. And that's not to say I'm not knocking supply teachers. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in the world, but that knowledge and relationship is and sense of being invested in is of fundamental importance, particularly for pupils that might be less secure in their attachments and their confidence and their relationships. I guess we can all see it from our own perspectives, can't we? I'm sure we've all got some feedback in our careers at some point from someone we don't have the tightest relationship with. Maybe you're not as petulant as me, but I'm far more likely to dismiss that than someone who knows me sort of really, really well, and I think is invested in me. Anyway, so feedback is a highly relational transaction, and taking it on board, I think, is more difficult than we think, particularly when we see it through the lens of our most disadvantaged, most vulnerable, least confident learners. Okay, so I'm just going to spend the last sort of 10 minutes on with a language focus. The language gap for me is the attainment gap, coupled with issues around social isolation. This is Walfogel and Washbrook, low income and early cognitive development. Pre-COVID, you'll see picking out, as with multiple other studies, this common link between growing up in low income groups, lower levels of language, high levels of behavior and behavior for learning difficulties. I suspect all of us in the room here can think of a pupil, who have experienced sort of these challenges. And I would argue that if we can get this right, we give pretty much everything we do in our schools, our education system, a better chance of success. Language is key to academic learning, key to relationships, it's key to friendships, it's key to social interactions, it's key to opportunity. It drives everything. The language gap is the attainment gap, and this is about us relentlessly focusing on those things that are in our gift. We cannot solve this with an intervention. It needs to be every moment being a language moment, but us using research evidence to inform how we respond to this. Being wary of chucking too much language at pupils at once, but being really precise in how we respond to this, but focus on what's in our gift to enable pupils to thrive in the classroom. I think one of the biggest challenges for our disadvantaged pupils in our classrooms is what I call the presumption of language, the presumption of background knowledge, the presumption of vocabulary, that I'm making presumptions about pupils' language that they don't have. And when I struggle with language comprehension in my lessons become something to get through rather than participate in. I'm always on the margins of lessons when I'm struggling with language comprehension, if I don't have the words to access the learning. Okay. We've got to be really wary of, chucking, too much language at pupils at once. And as this great article, from Harvard around, sometimes research evidence tells us what we already know, doesn't it? But it's about what Isabel Beck calls multiple meaningful interactions with language that build our language. Talk is at the heart of this. It's about those, as many interactions as we can with words to help us to build language. Got to be wary of trying to throw too many words at pupils at once. I was in a school, year 5 classroom in Wakefield a couple of months ago, and there was barely a spare space on any of the walls. There were about 250 individual pieces of vocabulary, some of it, not related to anything else. That's helpful if you're language rich. It's not helpful if you're language poor, because it's just overwhelming and not really accessible. So conversation to enable those meaningful interactions with language, key to success here. And then as a teacher in the classroom, that gives us a really good understanding of children's confidence and knowledge of words. And of course, the more we speak, the better we can read, the better we can write, the better our social interactions too. I just want to pick out a few examples here of what I mean by those meaningful interactions with language. And there's a great article on the Chartered College website called Deepening Knowledge Through Vocabulary Learning, based on Isabel Beck and her colleagues' work. It's a brilliant article. It'll take you about 15 minutes to read. It's Impact Article, Chartered College, Deepening Knowledge Through Vocabulary Learning, that tells us what evidence-based vocabulary learning looks like. And it is essentially those multiple meaningful interactions with a new language and rewarding pupils for use of that language across different sort of contexts. I'm going to give you some examples, again, just from our work in West Yorkshire. We're in a year 4 classroom, and the pupils were introduced to the word scheduled. A lot of the pupils didn't know the word scheduled. And this is where it's all in the planning. And it's a real skill as a teacher, I think, this, to be planning ahead. How do we anticipate and then plan for the key bits of language pupils are going to need to thrive in their lessons? Anyway, in this example, the word scheduled came up. And the teacher, I understand why they did this, said, Susie, can you go and look it up in the dictionary? Trying to encourage independent learning. But as you can see on the slide, the dictionary definition for scheduled is not particularly helpful if you don't understand the word scheduled, included or planned according to the schedule. So sometimes, if we're not careful, that if we're not sure, then it can entrench sort of language gaps. And we also have to line this with this notion of self-efficacy here, that if I put my hand up in the classroom and ask my teacher, as a less confident pupil, can you tell me what the word scheduled means? So I've been brave enough in front of my peers to ask. They all seem to know it. They all seem to magically know it. Why don't I? And my teacher tells me to look it up in the dictionary, and I still don't understand it. There's a fair chance I'm just going to keep my head down, and not interact with this and just sort of get through the lesson. But we can bring the language to life through putting those words in pupil-friendly examples. This, for me, is disadvantage. This is how we address the impact of disadvantage in the class and these day-to-day interactions. So as soon as we put that word scheduled into a pupil-friendly context, one that they will have knowledge of, that brings those words to life, makes them exciting and accessible. Forgive my northern stereotyping here, but we bring language to life, we make it exciting and we give pupils the ownership and the self-efficacy around language. So it's all in the planning. Another couple of examples, primary and secondary. The word grotesque came up in one of the classrooms. And because we hadn't properly planned for how we were going to teach that word, pupils asked, what does grotesque mean? And the teacher says, oh, it's similar to gross. And again, that isn't enough to help to build my knowledge of that word. We need to put it in pupil-friendly examples. We could use room on the broom, couldn't we? The grotesque monster climbed out of the swamp. We could use Beauty and the Beast. There's lots of examples that we could use. And a history lesson from Key Stage 3, a secondary school, where pupils, the word abolitionist was one of the key words from the lesson. And the pupils asked, what does abolitionist mean? And the response from the teacher was, someone who abolishes things. Again, that is not helpful to us if we don't have that background knowledge of the language. And it's not about criticizing teacher. I just think it's these interactions in the classroom that make all the difference, that sense of belonging for our disadvantaged pupils. So it's a real skill, this, I think, and these careful planning, ahead of the lessons to ensure pupils are included. One of the best ways, of course, we can build pupils' languages for them to become strong readers. This is University College London, a Millennium Cohort study that tells us that children who read with breadth, depth, and frequency have a better vocabulary than those that don't. You come here for searing insights like that this afternoon. But what we have to be wary of here is a superficial engagement with research evidence, because the whole notion of reading for pleasure is problematic if I'm struggling with reading fluency. If I struggle with fluency, reading is a slog for me. I'm unlikely to read with that breadth, depth, and frequency that I need to overcome the language gap associated with growing up on low incomes. And this is why schools and classrooms matters again, because we have the power to teach children to read well and enable them. Reading is key to poverty proofing, enrichment, opportunity, broadening horizons. Our classrooms matter. They really matter to our disadvantaged pupils. So we teach pupils to read well. It's not a golden ticket, but it's the closest thing that we've got to negating the impact of disadvantage on children's learning beyond the poverty proofing stuff around resources, those kinds of things. Key to a sense of belonging, that pupils become strong readers. On my final slide, and then I'll shut up, just around the background knowledge gap. And I just want to give a couple of examples here. It's these little interactions in the classroom that matter. So this is a year 4 classroom where we were looking at the impact of disadvantage on, there's a year 4 and a year 8 classroom here, examples. Anybody know what a shoe-billed stork is? It's the worst kind of teaching this, isn't it? I've got an answer in my head, can anybody guess it? But so a shoe-billed stork is a wading bird from southern Africa. And we, interestingly, it's that we talked at the school about the background knowledge gap for some disadvantaged pupils and limited vistas and limited experiences exacerbated by COVID over the last few years. Anyway, we talked to the pupils. This was part of this sentence was a key part of the literacy lesson they were having. Think about that Walfogel and Washbrook study about the vocabulary gap, all of those kinds of things. Really interestingly, all of the pupils in the year 4 classroom could read that sentence. They could read the shoe-billed stork traverses the swamp, stalking its prey. Some of the pupils could even put expression in the right places when they were reading it, so they could read the lines. None of them knew what a shoe-billed stork was, and there was no image to support it. They didn't know the word traverses. Lots of the pupils, a significant minority didn't know swamp. Lots of them didn't know the word stalking. And really surprisingly, that certainly surprised me, that pupils didn't know the word prey. They knew the word predator, didn't know the word prey. That's the presumption of language that I talked about a little bit earlier. So the pupils could read the lines. They couldn't read between the lines what they meant, and they certainly couldn't predict what followed, whether the shoe-billed stork snaffled the fish and gobbled it up in one gulp. That language is key to belonging in the classroom. The second one is about Indian partition, Pakistan, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. Again, the presumption of background knowledge, the presumption of language. The vast majority of pupils didn't understand the background knowledge that sat around this. We as adults can infer, can't we, from the word partition, that it's far away, never even visited, 2 million died. So we can use our background knowledge, to perhaps read between the lines on what follows. This is true. The person responsible for Indian partition never even visited on that 2 million dying is an estimate. So be wary in the classroom with that presumption of language. Be wary of the presumption of background knowledge, and also be wary of the presumption of good learning behaviours. It's not enough to say to pupils who lacks good self-regulation skills, can you take down that model in your book? It needs that explicit instruction to make sure that we know that Susie, who's quite likes opting out of the learning, has got that model in her book, so that she can, that worked example in a book, that so she can be independent in her learning later on. There's so much I could talk to you about, but I just want to finish by saying that, well, schools matter, classrooms matter to our disadvantaged pupils, and I hope I've illustrated that. And I think the final thing is that in our schools, let's get rid of that deficit discourse around disadvantage, that it's a problem with our disadvantaged pupils to be solved. This is about how we get better at ensuring that all pupils, irrespective of backgrounds and starting points, are thriving in our schools, thriving in our classrooms, and thriving in wider school life. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me. I was actually late for my own wedding, so I've managed to be on time. No, so I'm pretty pleased with that. Anyway, it comes up now again in conversation.
Any questions from anyone? No, you were clearly very, very explicit from the start, Mark.
I wasn't, Susie. I really wasn't, but anyway, really happy for my slides to be shared, and my contact details if anybody wants to come back afterwards as well. So look, thank you so much for coming and listening to me. It's really kind of you, so thank you.